Leicester Square. Believe it or not, Leicester Square was once a very fashionable address. It started life as the gardens of Leicester House, home of the Earl of Leicester, before being opened to the public in the 17th century. Residents have included William Hogarth, the satirical painter who chronicled life in 18th century London in all its colourful vulgarity, as well as Sir Joshua Reynolds. Reynolds was a hugely sought-after portrait artist, and he was also the first president of the Royal Academy, which I mentioned earlier when we were talking about Burlington House in Piccadilly. You can see a bust of Sir Joshua Reynolds here, towards the centre of the square, just beyond the gates by the grass. A bust of William Hogarth is also on this side of the square, but at the far end, and Sir Isaac Newton is down to the right of Reynolds. But the largest statue, the one in the middle of the square, is Baron Grant. He's less famous these days than his neighbours, but Grant is given prominence because he was the Member of Parliament who tried during the 19th century to stop the decline of Leicester Square. Today the square is best known for the cinemas around it and for the opening nights of blockbuster movies complete with red carpets and paparazzi. 4. Trafalgar Square. Of all the statues in the square, this one on the traffic island nearest Whitehall is the oldest. It's Charles I, and it dates back to 1633, just a few years after he was executed. The traffic island it's on, by the way, is the official centre of London. But the most prominent feature of Trafalgar Square is, of course, Nelson's Column. Horatio Nelson is probably Britain's most celebrated naval hero, and his great victory was at Trafalgar off the coast of Spain in 1805. Napoleon had plans to invade Britain as part of his attempts to gain military and economic domination of Europe. Admiral Lord Nelson and his fleet saw off the French invaders, but Nelson died towards the end of the battle. This square was laid out 25 years after the Battle of Trafalgar in 1830, and Nelson's Column, which is 145 feet high, was built 10 years after that. The lions were added in 1860, and the fountains arrived a little later. During the Second World War, it's said, Adolf Hitler was so impressed by Nelson's Column that he ordered his bombers to spare it so that he could install it in Berlin after he'd won the war. Now let's look around the square. Again, with your back to the Whitehall entrance, right round to the left, you can see Admiralty Arch, which is actually 3 arches and was built in 1910 as a memorial to Queen Victoria. It currently houses government offices. Further round to the right, the large building in yellow stone with the Greek temple entrance on the side is Canada House.
And so were surprised to see us driving on the left, as if we were driving on the wrong side. It's time to set the record straight. As far back as antiquity, men on horseback carried their swords on the left, and so crossing to that side would have been taken as a challenge to a duel. Much later, Napoleon, him again, knew that tradition dictated that battles should begin on the left flank of the cavalry. So he decided to play the surprise game by training his men to attack from the right. Fair play, isn't it? And it worked. Napoleon became master of Europe and imposed this right-hand traffic on everyone, all except the undefeated English. And things remained the same ever since.
It's the largest concentration of universities and colleges in the world. 400,000 students bring life to the city. I'm 35 years old. Can I say that I still feel a bit like a student? The good thing here is that you're allowed to find your own way. You can do sociology at Oxford and end up in a big bank, or vice versa. Especially when it's Oxford, of course. There are a few names like that. Oxford, Cambridge, or the London School of Economics. Names that impress and live up to their reputation. They attract talent from all over the world, and the courses are really cosmopolitan.
To be honest, I haven't been to the Temple District that often. Temple takes its name from the Temple Church, which once belonged to the Knights Templar. When the order was dissolved, the Pope distributed their lands, which were partly rented out to law students. This is how Temple became the legal district of London. So, keep your eyes peeled, because Temple, on the one hand, is home to the law schools that train future clerks, lawyers, notaries, and other members of the bar, and on the other hand, home to the courts that judge private law cases and send you straight behind bars. All Victorian buildings where London lawyers can enjoy restaurants, libraries, and even private gardens. What a better way to relax after a good life sentence than a little luncheon on the grass. A British dinner party, you'll have to learn the etiquette. You can bring a bottle of wine or a box of chocolate, but flowers must be sent the next day. Here, you must leave your hands under the table. And don't get too excited about debates. We English don't like to be pushed around too much or contradicted. Be conciliatory and restrained. On the other hand, make sure you remember the first names of people you meet. Here, people call each other by their first name, even their boss. No Mr. X or Mrs. Y. And if someone calls you my dear, don't get carried away. It's part of the rules. As far as punctuality is concerned, it's quite simple. When you're invited at 8 p.m., it's 8 p.m., not 8:15 p.m. And as for criticizing the quality of the food, it's like everywhere else in the world. You wait until you're in the taxi on the way back.
I like to go to churches to meditate. The English capital is full of them. As my office is not far away, I often come and have a moment of calm here at St. Bride's Church. The atmosphere inside is gentle and serene. I'm a bit hyperactive, but here I always manage to find some quiet me time. One thing I can tell you is that this church has been through a lot. The Great Plague in the 17th century decimated the parish. The Great Fire of London burned it to the ground. Lightning in the 18th century made it lose its spire. And the German bombings in 1940 destroyed the nave. Each time, thank God, it was restored and made beautiful again. Its multi-story bell tower looks like a wedding cake. Oh, if only it could nudge my destiny a little for me.
In the typical Victorian Gothic style and grey stone are the Royal Courts of Justice, popularly known as the Law Courts. They are simply magnificent, almost intimidating, with the cathedral-like appearance of some of the palaces. It feels almost like a religious experience. But don't let yourself be overwhelmed. Dare to enter and experience the atmosphere of the trials for yourselves. Many of the courts are open every day. You have to book a tour for selected dates, and you'll see the Great Hall, an exhibition of legal costumes. Hear the history of famous cases. In the maze of corridors, you can see lawyers reciting their arguments and get a glimpse of the courtrooms. It is a hive of activity where destinies are played out. English law is above all common law or case law. Judges make laws by creating precedents through their rulings, so there's a lot at stake. I love it. See that memorial with the menacing-looking dragon statue on top? That's the buses, Punks, Big Ben, and St. Pauls Cathedral. That's automatic. Its imposing dome is on every leaflet and chocolate box. The dome, of course, reminds us of St. Peter's in Rome. To be honest, I've never been to Rome, but I know St. Paul's, and I know that in the crypt lay some beautiful people. Admiral Nelson, Wellington, Lady Di and Prince Charles were married there. You may remember the fire that took place in Notre Dame de Paris in 2019. Well, the same thing happened to us Londoners in 1666, except that at the time, firefighters weren't equipped and the cathedral was completely consumed. Fortunately, the reconstruction was a success. The credit for this jewel goes to the famous English architect Christopher Wren, who, for the anecdote, had proposed to put a giant pineapple instead of the dome. That would have been worth its weight in fibre. And now, the £10,000 question. Who caused the fire in 1666? An arsonist? No, a baker called Mr. Fariner. The fool forgot to put out one of his ovens. A spark fell on a pile of straw and central London burned. I hope he had a good insurance.
So I'd like to tell you about the Royal Exchange. It's the symbol of England's commercial glory. Its pediment with its large neoclassical columns reminiscent from ancient temples is magnificent. It was, above all, the first undercover commodity exchange of the City of London, founded in 1565 by a certain Thomas Gresham, an advisor to the Queen. Gresham coined the phrase, "Bad money drives out good." At that time in England, there were two types of coin, gold sovereigns and silver shillings. When the value of silver fell in favor of gold, people would melt down their gold sovereigns and exchange them for silver at its commercial value, and then mint them in shillings, making them worth more in gold. Silver circulated whilst gold disappeared from the circuits. Bimetallism was increasingly shaky. Gresham's maxim still holds true. Well, that's my little economics lesson over for today. You can all wake up now. Stock market activity here came to an end before the Second World War. The Royal Exchange is now a shopping centre that I love. Inside, in the courtyard, there is Prada, Tod's, and Tiffany the jewellers. Beautiful shop windows, empty wallets. I'm not the Queen's advisor, but my theory works too. This bridge is in London, and when I say old, I mean old. It was built in the 1st century, in the time of the Romans. Don't look at it with contempt. It was the only way to cross the Thames for a long time. Initially made of wood, it has been rebuilt countless times, the last time being in 1973. London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady.
This space rocket, doesn't it make you want to take off into space? This 309-meter-high glass tower with 72 habitable floors was Europe's tallest tower when it opened in 2012. Since then, Russia has entered the race. The Shard is the work of the famous architect Renzo Piano, and for the record, it takes its name, Shard, from English heritage, which was very critical at the time, and which said that it would be a shard of glass piercing the heart of old London. We have a very poetic way to raise critics here. Before you take off, make sure you think twice, because the price of a flat in the Shard starts at £40 million. You heard me right. At the same time, London is in the top 10 cities with the most billionaires. Waiting to win the lottery, I'll stick to the open-air public observatory on the 72nd floor. One does what one can.
Do you still...
Was the gateway to the riches of the world, with all the goods arriving into the London docks. Hayes Galleria, formerly Hayes Wharf, was known as the larder of London, where tea was delivered. Once a thriving dock and a hive of activity where 80% of dry produce imported into London was processed. The wharf was sadly destroyed in the Second World War, finally getting a new lease of life in the 1980s when the tea and goods warehouses were transformed into offices, shops and restaurants. Today it stands out as an architectural statement, nestled on the River Thames with panoramic views of the City of London. If you stroll around the numerous bars and restaurants, you will also notice a wonderful sculpture called the Navigators that is inspired by the historic wharf. Some say this is where steampunk all began. In the words of the artist David Kemp, high but not dry in the pool of London, the iron fish dreams of voyages past, steaming through typhoons and pack ice. Time and tides ebb and flow past its dock at Hayes Galleria, a reconstructed Thameside wharf once known as the Larder of London.
BBC, Auntie, the Beeb. There's no shortage of nicknames for the world's oldest public broadcaster, already a century old. The history of the BBC is the history of 20th century Europe. Personally, I listen to the BBC News every morning, either while jogging or on my way to work. Initially private and experimental, the BBC soon became a public company incorporated by Royal Charter. It had its moment of glory during the Second World War. King George VI's speech on the 6th of June 1944 was heard by more than 80% of the British population. Can you imagine? And the relationship between the BBC, the government and the British Secret Service over time has been a real melodrama. For decades, the BBC denied that they only hired people approved by MI5. Tony Blair blamed it for its coverage of the Iraq War, David Cameron for its political bias, and Boris Johnson accused it of serving the anti-conservatives. And yet, The Beeb remains Britain's darling little radio.
Yeah!
The glass bulb near Tower Bridge is the City Hall of London, and also the seat of the Greater London Authority and London Assembly. I've been defending its strange shape ever since I found out that the building was designed that way to save energy. Its semi-spherical shape exposes it to direct sunlight. It uses cold water from the ground to keep the building cool. No electric ventilation. And this water is then injected into the toilets for flushing. The heat from the computers and office lights is recycled. In short, this building is a champion of ecology. It consumes a quarter of the energy used by a conventional building of the same size. Of course, you do have to accept its shape.
Tower Bridge, as iconic as Big Ben, I think. This legendary bridge dates from the end of the 19th century. It was much needed because at the time, there was so much traffic on the Thames that you could cross it by jumping from boat to boat. A bridge. What better way to keep yourself dry? But be careful, this bridge is not a dam. Quite the opposite. With its 11,000 tons of steel and 70,000 tons of concrete, this huge bridge tilts up to let the boats pass. I'll skip the technical details, but what an amazing mechanism. I took American friends to the top. Through a glass panel, they could see the cars circulating under their feet. Then, the huge bridge rising. It was so impressive. Now, I'm not trying to scare you, but you should know that in the 1950s, a bus driver got stuck on a rising bascule. He managed to jump off and land on the road and was rewarded for his courage. Shall we try it now? London Bridge Tube Station is an authentic light cruiser, the HMS Belfast. Built in 1939, at the time, the largest cruiser ever built for the Royal Navy. She served throughout World War II, played a leading part at the Battle of North Cape and in the Normandy landings, and she also joined the United Nations naval forces during the Korean War. Britain ruled the waves for centuries with its fleet, as Napoleon found out at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805.
But it is actually more like an all-inclusive fortress, with walls, moat and everything. The tower has played a huge part in England's history, earning the UNESCO World Heritage Site label and housing the crown jewels. It has been besieged several times, used as an armory, a treasury, a menagerie and a prison. This is where the expression to be sent to the tower, meaning to be imprisoned, comes from. Today, there are no longer human beings locked up, but rather ravens. Yes. An old legend says that if the ravens in the Tower of London disappear, the crown will fall, and England with it. So, we always keep a few birds in captivity just in case, with their wings clipped to stop them getting away. Does this technique also work with men? Was a Roman defensive wall built between the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE around the important port city of Londinium. I believe it is pronounced Londinium, if I remember correctly. This 3-kilometre-long, 6-metre-high wall surrounded an area of 130 hectares and comprised 6 gates. The Great Fire of London in 1666 marked the beginning of a series of demolitions of the London Wall. Over time, large sections of the wall became part of other structures. The funny thing is that to this day, this wall's route has actually structured the city's development. Much of the current road network follows the locations of the former wall gates. So if you're stuck in traffic, take your complaints to the Romans. Underground is the oldest and longest network in the world, with almost 300 stops and 1 billion passengers a year. In 2019, it was elected Metro of the Year. We call it the Tube, simply because its tunnels are shaped like pipes. And the Tube is a movie star, appearing in numerous movies, such as Mission Impossible 2, Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow, whose decision whether or not to board a train forms the whole plot of the film, Thor, The Dark World, and even Star Wars Rogue One, where Canary Wharf Station acts as a spaceship.
Make rankings to see what is the most expensive city in the world. I can't tell the rank of London in this weird list, but let's just say it deserves its place at the top. First of all, housing. In central London, one can expect to pay between £14,000 and £16,000 per square metre. On the transport side, the Oyster card is called Oyster because it is as luxurious as oysters. at about £230 per month. Many young English people, or not so young, prefer to cycle, and it's good for the calves. Healthcare is more expensive than elsewhere in Europe, as is education, with an average of £17,000 per year for a public school. But there are also some good deals, such as the famous meal deal, the lunch pack that any self-respecting London supermarket will provide you with for £3. A sandwich, a packet of crisps, and a soda. It's a bargain, isn't it? Is one of the world's leading museums for modern and contemporary arts. Tate Modern is the small name of the British National Museum of Modern Art. Its huge 100 meters high concrete chimney makes it look more like a factory than a museum. This is normal for a former power station. After 4 years of intensive renovation work, the museum opened its doors in 2000. The machine room, for example, had become the venue for contemporary exhibitions. This transformation is a good symbol of what we call the New London, which knows how to reinvent itself without denying its industrial heritage. Inside are numerous artistic masterpieces of the 20th century. Our friends Warhol, Dali, Picasso, and Rothko are all waiting for you with their audacious imaginations. The Thames is the soul of London. It passes under many bridges in the capital and flows into the North Sea. It's more than a big trickle of water. This river stopped Julius Caesar in his tracks when he invaded Great Britain. It was he who called it Thamesis. When William the Conqueror came to power in the 11th century, he got the river trade going again. Since then, the Thames has allowed England to develop and prosper. But it's not all good news. The Thames was so polluted in the 19th century with the industrial revolutions that it was called the Great Stink. Nice. It was even thought to be biologically dead. Fortunately, it's coming back to life. The British have done some major work. I won't go swimming there, but I've heard that you can meet families of seahorses.
It's called the Golden Jubilee Bridge. Isn't it majestic, with its white cables that make you think of sailing ships? And original, with its double bridge, one for pedestrians and one for the train. What's more, it was named after Queen Elizabeth II's Golden Jubilee, celebrating 50 years on the throne. Who said it's been a long time? I heard you. Have some respect. For me, London by night, Big Ben, London Eye, Buckingham Palace, all lit up, are just like a festival of light in the Queen's honour.
The London Eye is a funfair wheel, only bigger. Personally, I hate funfairs. But let's face it, this wheel is pretty good. The gondolas are beautiful. Take your sweetheart over the Thames to see Big Ben, the city, and Westminster in the distance. Are you afraid of heights? I understand. A 135 meters high wheel is something. But don't worry, you'll feel safe. I took my godson there. One spin later, he was speechless. All my friends who come to London ask to see the Millennium Wheel, so I take them there at night. I'll never get tired of the illuminated wheel. Big Ben, the famous iconic Big Ben, the symbol of England. In fact, in 2008, it was voted best film location in the capital. You could probably name loads of films where its characteristic tune can be heard. To be precise, Big Ben is not the name of the tower itself, that's Elizabeth Tower, but of the bell at the top. The tower, which belongs to the Palace of Westminster, is a Gothic structure over 100 meters high, with a giant clock on each of its 4 sides. And I'm sorry for you, but only people with special permission can visit Big Ben. Actually, I've never been inside. But I'm working on it. A symbol of the British parliamentary monarchy. The Palace of Westminster is the seat of the United Kingdom's Parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. The building was originally used as a royal residence, but no monarch has lived there since the 16th century. A terrible fire, one more, almost completely destroyed the palace in 1834. The palace in front of you only dates from the 19th century. It is sumptuous, isn't it? This masterpiece is a pure example of neo-Gothic perfection. I know I seem to know a lot about it, but to be honest, I read it in a book. The palace, a gigantic complex with more than 1,000 rooms, also houses libraries, vestibules, dining rooms, bars, and even gymnasiums. A real city. And, of course, the famous Elizabeth Tower, which houses the large Big Ben.
This big white church with its two majestic towers is the famous Westminster Abbey. According to legend, it was founded in the 7th century after a fisherman had an apparition of the disciple Peter. Don't ask me who he is. He's unknown. That's all I know. Can you imagine if we had done the same for every single hallucination that happened in this city? Mind you, when you see the number of churches in London, a couple of saints must have come down to the city in the last few centuries. Anyway, today the Abbey is one of the most important religious buildings in London, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the coronation place of almost all the English monarchs, and the burial place of a fair number of kings and queens of England, as well as many prime ministers, artists, actors, explorers, not to mention the unknown warrior. The last time I went to Victoria Tower Gardens, it was in a black cab. You know those iconic London big black taxis? The driver told me that in order to drive this kind of taxi, he had to pass a test that took him 4 years, for which he had to memorize the 25,000 streets of the capital and more than 20,000 monuments. No wonder they're more expensive than Uber. But back to the point. The Victoria Tower Gardens is a public park built in the 19th century along the north bank of the Thames. As the name suggests, the gardens are adjacent to the Victoria Tower, near the Palace of Westminster. In autumn and winter, like many parks, they do look a bit dull. But in summer, taxi or not, I love to come for a picnic, read or sunbathe on the lawn, admiring Rodin's Bourgeois de Calais sculpture. Park where you think you're in Hyde Park, but you're not. You're in Kensington Gardens. Well, it's still bound by a fence. For me, Kensington Gardens is all about Lady Diana. She used to live in Kensington Palace. Right next to it stands the Diana Memorial Playground, a huge pirate ship in a small amusement park for children. If you want to get a feel for the place, I recommend having a jasmine tea in the beautiful orangery, a former greenhouse. Or take a walk through the gardens and play with the bronze statue of Peter Pan, the Londoner who wouldn't grow up. I discovered the RAF Bomber Command Memorial one day completely by chance after leaving the Hard Rock Cafe. I was intrigued by what looked like a pile of statues from a distance, and as I moved in closer, I discovered this memorial to mark the sacrifice of 55,573 airmen from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other Allied countries, as well as civilians of all nations killed during air raids in the Second World War. It's pretty impressive, I have to say, probably in no small part due to these very large, realistic bronze statues, which allow us to see just how technically detailed the pilot's clothing was. You feel really small standing in front of these giants.
In the 17th century, King Charles II expressed the wish to be able to walk from Buckingham to Hyde Park at his ease, while still staying at home. So he said to himself, well, let's put a park in between. Here, you are still in royal territory. The place was built on swampy grounds, with a stream still running underneath. That's probably why it's so green. But don't be fooled by its serenity. At one time, people used to come here to fight duels. Today, you can stroll around without the risk of a stray bullet. Once, I even saw a policeman taking a nap here. Maybe that's why the police are not armed in London. They can doze off safely.
Originally, the Royal Marshy Grounds of Green Park served as an annex to St. James's Hospital next door, which buried its lepers there. Very nice. I had the same reaction when I was first told this. Is that why flowers don't grow there anymore? Well, if you prefer, here's a more glamorous explanation. According to legend, it's because of Catherine, the wife of King Charles II. She caught her husband picking flowers for his mistress. Mad with anger, she ordered all petals, stems, and pistils to be removed. A futile attempt. Flowers have disappeared from her lawn, but not the horns from her head. Very nice, right? Who celebrated their engagement there told me that it was wonderful to be greeted by the concierge as if they were arriving home. The Ritz in London is classy and warm. Prince William and Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, often dine in the private dining room away from prying eyes. And the breakfast served in a Victorian dining room by waiters dressed in attire straight out of Downton Abbey is said to be enchanting. The thing to do is to book a table for afternoon tea. In a hushed atmosphere, you take your tea the English way. Each sandwich is perfectly soft and made with different types of bread. The scones are just right, and the clotted cream is to die for. Oh, it makes me drool just thinking about it. I'm addicted to clotted cream, which is not surprising as the southwest of England, where I'm from, is famous for it. I was also told that there is even a children's choir singing carols at Christmas time. Magical. But remember, jacket and tie are mandatory for men. No tie, no tea. For high-end shopping, there's Bond Street. Even if you don't intend to buy anything, you must go into one of these luxury boutiques to experience English service. And if you want to try out a legendary London brand, go to Burberry's. The brand has completely revamped its in-store shopping experience with screens all over the place. Digital technology serving tradition. By the way, Bond Street has nothing to do with 007. Besides, there is no Bond Street as such, but two different sections. Old Bond Street to the south and New Bond Street to the north. There was a plan to combine them under one name, but it was rejected by the locals.
English people say it's like Piccadilly Circus. They're talking about an overcrowded, congested place. Piccadilly Circus is exactly that. A buzzing square where you always run into someone. Although there's nothing special about the architecture, except for the circular circus-like shape, you can still feel a powerful energy here, like a bubbling hub, opening up to many things. Shopping on Oxford Street, culture in West End cinemas, and last but not least, Soho, the heart of London's nightlife. I really love this place, especially at night when the lights of the big advertising screens illuminate the square. That's the moment to shut down my computer and go and enjoy London's nightlife. Soho is
Here.
Don't cry. Maybe we'll meet again tomorrow,
We hope you had a good time with us.
and that you have made our beloved city your own.
Come on. So long, my friends, as they say. So long.